Hello, everyone. This is Data Driven Chat, and today I'm really excited to talk to Michaela Mahlberg, who is Professor of Linguistics, of Corpus Linguistics at the University of Birmingham. Did I get it correct, Michaela?
Yes. Hi.
Hi. It's great to have you with us. Thank you so much for finding the time to talk to me today. I know you're very busy. So Michaela has a long list of things that she has done in her career. So I'm very, very excited to talk to her today. And today we're mostly going to talk about corpus linguistics and hopefully a little bit about data science and a little bit about synergies between data science and linguistics. But let's just get straight into it. And the first question that I wanted to ask you was a question about your personal journey. Can you tell us how did you get into corpus linguistics? Why corpus linguistics? Is it something that you always wanted to do, or is it something that you just got interested in once you started your degree in the university? So tell us basically about your personal journey.
Yeah, I mean, at the time when I went to university, corpus linguistics wasn't something, where you would say, this is what I always wanted to do, because I kind of happened to come across corpus linguistics. So I basically did a degree in English and mathematics because I wanted to become a teacher in secondary schools. And then I took this one module that was something called corpus linguistics. And I found that really so interesting because I could kind of see how my two subjects that I was basically studying quite separately actually made a lot of sense together. And also at that time, I was just doing in mathematics, you had to learn how to program. So, this is in the olden days where people still did Fortran and Pascal and things like this. So it was really kind of interesting to see how you could do two things that you really liked together. And there was enough of both of it in it. And so I thought, that is really the thing I want to continue working in. And that then took me into corpus linguistics. And I think that combination is something that I've enjoyed ever since.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of people who listen to this podcast are interested in data science, and they probably heard about conversational AI, but I'm guessing not many have heard about corpus linguistics. So can you explain how, I mean, you already started talking about the synergies between computer science and corpus linguistics. So can you explain to our audience how whether corpus linguistics is related to data science, and if it is related, then how is it related to data science?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting how you ask all these really good questions, hitting the nail on the head already. Is corpus linguistics isn't, again, the sexiest term. This isn't something where people immediately will say, oh, I've heard about this. Or when I talk to people outside of academia, you always need to find a way of explaining what you do, ideally by linking it to other things. So if you say what I do is kind of linguistics with computers, it's very similar to computational linguistics, it's very similar to data science, people do understand that much better. And about your question of how is it related to data science, I mean, you could see corpus linguistics as the data science of language studies, where the data that you're working with is language data, and you're doing a lot of things that are really similar to what people do in data science. So you use software, you use programs, trying to find patterns, looking at trends, identifying similarities, trying to visualize relationships. But obviously I'm not a data scientist, I'm a corpus linguist. So for me, data science is broader because of the variety of data that you have. And in linguistics, your corpora are really evidence of linguistic behavior. So it's either texts that are already electronic versions of texts, or you have transcribed spoken language, or you have multimodal corpora where you've got visuals, images in it as well. But it's all analyzed from a linguistic point of view. Obviously, if you, and I've done this because I sometimes like doing these things, if you look a bit through what's on offer in terms of data science tools and data science modules, there's a lot of stuff that is really very, very similar what people learn in terms of how you compare sets, what statistical tools you use, what kind of programs you run. But it's really, for us, the emphasis is on the linguistic insight. And therefore, in corpus linguistics, there's then also a lot of qualitative analysis there as well. So if you analyze a lot of texts, obviously you can't read the corpus. So you can't go through and read every single text, but you will still read a sufficient amount of text or analyze enough in detail so that you can get complementary information. And I think that is where I see the difference from data science, but also the similarities and the opportunities.
Mm-hmm. So, for example, one of my friends used to do this. Used to be involved in. I think it's called the Babylon project, which is, I think, where linguists are trying to prove that there was kind of one initial language out of which like many languages developed. So I guess that's already proved, right? Or is it? Am I wrong there? And you know, is it something that corpus linguistics does? So I mean, is it? I guess what I'm asking is it really? Just to kind of expand on what you said, is it a historical science where you study how language develops, or is it quite kind of situational, dependent on a problem, right? So how, for example, people use language in a particular situation or in a particular context, or is it both?
Yeah, it is actually both, because if you look at all the areas that you have in linguistics, you can have historical linguistics where you look, you know, from a diachronic point of view. You can have pragmatics where you're really interested in the conversational situation. You can look at the description of language varieties. You can look at translation studies. All this has language that is studied, and you could do all of that with corpus methods. So it's really, you know, it's not just historical, it's not just here and now, it's not just discourse, it's anything in linguistics where you can use the data to then look at the quantification and these frequency dimensions that you can study. And to me, then, that isn't just linguistics necessarily, but kind of you can branch out into all sorts of disciplines where language is foundational to understand what is going on, how you communicate, and what you do with this.
Yeah, so considering that we use language pretty much for everything or some sort of communication, then I guess it's sort of a science of everything, not a theory of everything, but a science of everything, right? Because even in behavioral science now, we use, obviously, and data scientists as well, equally, they use a lot of kind of language data to do topic modeling, to do sentiment analysis. I know there were recent studies about how precise terms get, how, I don't know, different genders use language differently, different nations use language differently. So it's really exciting. So, Michaela, I know that you have, like I said, a long list of things that you have done in your career. But if I asked you about one thing that you're particularly proud of, what would you pick?
Yeah, that is obviously a difficult question. And I'd probably think I wouldn't make this a particular event or a particular grant or a particular publication. But I think what I'm really proud of, looking across my own development, is finding an approach or finding a way of working that made it possible to seek connections. Because, you know, even in corpus linguistics, it's very easy to keep what you do in a very specific box. So to say, you know, like I'm doing historical corpus linguistics, or I'm doing this particular area of corpus linguistics. But what I've always found fascinating, and it is a lot of work and it doesn't always work, is trying to bring things together that you can't at first see how they actually work together or what you would gain by looking at them in a joined up way. And I mean, one of the things where I have done this now for really quite a long period of time is looking at the language of literature and trying to find out, what happens when you analyze literary text and what you gain by using corpus methods for this, but not just entirely going quantitative entirely, but trying to keep the subjective and the qualitative element of the literary analysis together with it. So that is one thing that I really enjoyed for these connections. And as you know, because you're writing a wonderful chapter for this as well, I'm really so happy that at the moment I can do this in this handbook of Corpus Linguistics, where we're trying to bring together a lot of people who think in different way, come from different areas, might not normally talk to each other, but actually now come together to get different perspective on similar phenomena. And I just enjoy this enormously.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm also really excited about the handbook. Really looking forward to when it's going to come out. Can you tell us actually when it is going to come out, and the publisher as well?
Yeah, the publisher, this will be Bloomsbury, and so whether we can get it out for 2022. Obviously, there's a lot at this point in time where you don't know, but we're aiming for 2022.
So yeah, everyone who is listening, look out for this handbook in 2022, and I guess it's a good idea to subscribe to maybe Michaela's social media accounts to figure out when it's going to come out in any case. So keep that in mind. So the next question, Michaela, that I have for you. Well, I'm actually really fascinated by people who are doing something, some kind of studies in humanities, and I'm particularly interested in. I know that you have done a lot of work in language as a social phenomenon, and you just talked about it as well. So does it help you in real life? Or how does it help you in real life? So for example, I know that you have an interest in deception, so I was wondering whether you can maybe tell when someone is lying by what they're saying. So are there any practical examples that you can give our audience of when, or maybe it doesn't, maybe it doesn't really, it cannot really be immediately applied, in which case it's also interesting.
Well, no, I think actually, to me, studying language, so the way I like to study language, this isn't necessarily the way everyone would like to study language, but the way I like studying language is seeing it ultimately as an applied undertaking. So for me, linguistics is ultimately really an applied discipline. And then with corpora specifically, what makes it so applied is that a corpus is a collection of evidence. So a corpus is evidence of what people do, evidence of what people say. And the more you have of this evidence, the more you can find out about what is typical, what happens repeatedly, what are the habits of people, how would they normally behave, how do a lot of people behave when a lot of people collectively do something, say something, form an opinion. And that is what makes it amazingly applied. I mean, quickly to your question about lying, obviously that is something that has concerned people for a very long time. Wouldn't it be nice if you could immediately tell if someone was lying? And the way linguistics comes into this is to think about storytelling. We all just tell stories about what we do, and lying is a question of to what extent does the story diverge from what actually happened and what you actually experienced, or and sometimes people can't even tell themselves. The longer it is in the past that something happened, the more you make the story work for you, which isn't necessarily deliberately lying, but it's just accommodating it into the way you think at this point in time. And there are studies that look at stylistic devices, ways of using pronouns, ways of referring to people and events, the level of detail that you give, and then compare how likely it is that you can do this with a made-up story or with something that you actually had to experience. But I think what I find even more interesting than lying for where individual people lie is what happens in society as a whole. So the view of the world of a particular group, and that is again where it becomes very close to data science, because you need a lot of information and a lot of evidence, and in today's society, it's really, there's so much information out there, and strictly speaking, you should think, oh, now that we have all this information, now that there's Google, we can have news channels 24/7, we can check on Wikipedia what's going on. It should be really easy to find out what is happening, but actually it's now even more difficult than it was, when people had to write a letter and then someone on a horse had to deliver that letter. That's a bit of information that moved from here to there. But today you've got this explosion of everything is out there, and everything can turn into a story that people can try to drive. And what I find interesting in there is to see how can you drive these stories, or what things do you need to put into the system, or what influences, and how can that shape then behavior, attitudes, the discourse. So if you look at examples, people's attitudes of fears and emotions, that is really almost more important than facts today, because if you look at, the list of examples is endless. If you look at modern history, you can start with Brexit and come to the American presidential election, and as a linguist, you can have a field day looking at what's going on in that regard. And big topics, now you have anti-vaxxers, now that we finally got a coronavirus vaccine, or you've got pandemic deniers anyway. And what is actually happening in the discourse to make people accept certain positions, go along with a particular way of the story, in spite of all the graphs and numbers and figures that you might get. And I think that is really the interesting bit. And maybe before I say too much, but maybe a few more simple examples without going into politics and the state of the world immediately. What you get when you look at language like this, where you really need, the linguistic observation, rather than just finding out how Trump is, tweeting in a way that, it is more obvious to see what is happening, rather than looking at subtle linguistic nuances. It's these linguistic nuances that, again, I find particularly interesting, because for that, you need a lot of data, and you need to see what is habitual without actually being too striking. And that is the thing that's then really influential, because as human beings, we're not very good at saying, at being aware of what we say. These typical examples you probably seen is when people make fun of over usage of words like, or and then she says and he says and things like this. Or where was it I wanted to go with this? That it's really the subtleties that are important. So when you look at shall I take an example? Maybe then it's easier. So something I've been looking at.
One thing I'm gonna ask you. I was gonna ask you about some more examples now, but I really can relate to what you said, because a lot of my students in behavioral science, they are all interested in fake news. When they come to me with this topic, I always tell them, well, how do you define fake news? Because the same event could be. I remember when I was a student, we used to read a lot of John Dewey's work, and it's about kind of historical fact and all this, when the same historical fact could be described by the same people in completely, by two different people in completely different ways. So so this is all, I think, related to what you're saying, that the same event can be interpreted. I don't know, American presidential election could be interpreted by two different groups of people differently, right? And everyone will believe that this is the true reflection of what is happening. But so the next thing that I wanted to ask, and then that's kind of where I hope that you will tell us kind of more examples, give us more examples of corpus linguistics studies, perhaps, or things that are of interest to you, is basically what actually can we learn from language? Because my personal experience is mostly with sentiment primarily, and perhaps topic modeling. So but I guess there are so many things that you can learn from the language, and if you could give us some examples, that'd be awesome.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So if you look at a very narrow view of what you can get from language, is very often people think it's about understanding the meaning of words, having a way of, if you have a language that you don't speak, you check in the dictionary, you know what the meaning is, and then you can form sentences, and then you can start speaking a language and things like this. But it's also, and that probably relates then to your work on sentiment again as well, it's also about the attitudes around words. So not just, the simple, this is a table, this is what a table looks like, and I give you a picture and then you know the meaning, but also if you've got a word, what does that word do in discourse? And, I've got some of these very easy examples that are also very nice in teaching. If you look at things like word smoking, for instance, I mean, it's quite a straightforward, very clear meaning where, a native speaker would immediately be able to explain to you somehow what smoking means. If you then start looking at different data sets to see how people talk about smoking, you see that if you look at Guardian newspapers, you get a lot of discourse around, smoking and banning smoking. What happens if you have to ban smoking outside? What will that do to the economy? How do smoking rates compare across countries, different parts of society? Is there a difference between smoking and using e-cigarettes? And a lot around a particular view of the world and an evaluation. So not just a description, but also an evaluation of what that means to society. And then going back to your earlier point about the historical, it's then also quite interesting to look at this over time, because smoking wasn't always looked at like this. Okay, this has to do with medical insights as well, but smoking also used to be described as something that is quite, if you're sitting at home, if you're comfortably sitting in front of the fire and you're talking to friends and people are smoking a cigar, people smoke a pipe, something like this. Smoking is also very gendered. If you look at when did women start smoking, there was this thing about cigarettes as torches of freedom, and a certain generation looked at this as, this is a feminist approach and a way of expression, and also the kinds of, without going into too much detail, the kinds of things that people smoke, whether it's cigarettes, pipes, or cigars, there's a lot associated with this. And so that is something that is very much prime examples of corpus linguistics. And then if you look at this today, this whole health discourse, the idea of public health is not just around smoking, because then you can compare this to other things. So another one of my favorite examples is coffee. If someone asks you what's the meaning of coffee, that is pretty easy to explain. But if you then read about coffee, it's a lot about how many cups of coffee, will coffee harm fertility? Will coffee make you long-term I don't know, unhealthy? How does coffee today compare to eating red meat? Things like this. You can see how this then also is a view of the world where topics that have to do with your individual responsibility and your health and society's view of what you do all come together. And then to add another example to this is what I find then quite fascinating is if you look at, again, different data sets, so not just historical, but also in newspaper articles or more texts that describe the real world, and then fiction, and how these two relate, and what role things like coffee, all sorts of beverages, smoking play in fiction now, and how this is seen as role modeling.
Movies,
Sorry?
Smoking in movies. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. I mean, you remember Pulp Fiction, don't you? You look at, smoking in Pulp Fiction, and then some more recent movies where people explicitly don't smoke. You see them carrying a smoothie and drinking some really healthy things, but not have a cigarette. Or something I looked at is James Bond. If you look at the earliest James Bond novels, Casino Royale, for instance, if you do a frequency analysis on words in Casino Royale, cigarette is highly, highly frequent, because James Bond in Casino Royale is just smoking all the time. And no, it's really, and if you then look at the films, in the initial films, Sean Connery, you had him with a cigarette, but then it also changed to cigars, because it was kind of like, a style
status,
icon thing.
Status thing,
Yeah, exactly. So you couldn't imagine the Pierce Brosnan and James Bond with a cigarette, could you? This just wouldn't fit. And now the most recent ones, Bond isn't smoking at all anymore. And that is very much also a reflection of what you find in other data sets in terms of attitudes towards smoking. In the same way that you do product placement in films, you also do reflection of public attitudes and concerns like this. So yeah, do you see where I'm going with this? So that's and other examples is just one more. You can see I'm getting all excited. Another example I've been looking at recently is the discourse around water. Again, something that is very simple, very fundamental, but what you see in that discourse around water is we talk a lot about water companies and crisis and pollution and shortages, and then water bottles so that it brings it to plastic, and water cannons if you look at protests and all the rest of it. And if you compare this to texts like water in children's literature, books for children, what water is there for is, for children to wash their face, or you use water as a description of the place. This all happened down by the water, or let's meet down by the water. And also you have a phrase that has to do with people jumping into the water quite a lot. So you can see how the context really gives you quite different meaning. And that is, to sum this up, this is what corpus linguistics is all about, meanings in different contexts and attitudes and effects and all that.
One thing that I want to ask is just to kind of I know that we've went quite deep into the subject already, but with examples. But another quick thing I want to ask you is about English language versus other languages, because I think there is an obvious bias in the media and in science to some extent towards English. But what happens in other languages? Is corpus linguistics just as developed in other languages, or other like groups studying different languages? How does that work?
Yes. Oh, yes. Yeah. Corpus linguistics is really an international discipline. So there are lots of corpus linguists in other countries studying other languages as well. And there is a pan-European infrastructure providing corpus resources, so the Clarin infrastructure, where people have lots of repositories where you can actually see what corpora are there for different languages, what tools and what resources do you have. And this is also really important for translation and cross-cultural comparison, to see how corpora can describe other languages. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, because I mean the only dealing I had with other language once was someone from Finland who they did kind of quite interesting things, but obviously everything was in Finnish, and I don't speak Finnish, and I realized that there are, I don't know, probably about 7 million people in the world who speak this language, but that's amazing how you can also develop this corpus linguistics capabilities in other languages than English, and do maybe some comparative analysis as well. So so obviously, like I said, a lot of people who listen to this podcast are interested in data science, and the most common question that I get is about skills. So I'm going to ask you as well about the skill sets for corpus linguistics, and do you see a trend towards maybe learning more coding amongst the students, or is corpus linguistics becoming more quantitative? So how important is it to be able to code if you wanted to do corpus linguistics?
Yeah. Okay, so there's in corpus linguistics that is also quite an ongoing debate, actually. So there are some people who say you absolutely must be a proficient programmer so that you can write all the programs that you need yourself. And then there are other people who say, it's actually more important that you know a good programmer rather than writing it all yourself. And I think I'm a bit in between there, because I think really everyone should have done some programming before you go into corpus linguistics, even if you can't then write every program. And I must admit, I haven't done much programming myself over the past decades now, but you need that basic fundamental understanding, what happens and how you deal with the data and what is relevant and what is important. And you need to be able, when you work together with programmers and people who develop software, you need to be able to understand what is happening. I now know if, certain routines would take me forever to work out now, and I would probably spend 3 days checking them up in every textbook I can think of, and that is not very efficient. But then on the other hand, I still have enough understanding to see what is happening and to discuss with people where we need to go, what needs to happen, and how to approach certain problems. And I think that is absolutely fundamental. So I would wish if there was something like a standard for corpus linguistics, if you had, in the same way as you have for linguistics, an introduction to linguistics, if you had a beginner's semester basic programming with fundamentals of data sciencey stuff, that would be really ideal. And then throughout someone's career, I think it's really important that you work in teams. So I don't think that corpus linguistics is a one-man or one-woman show. You really need to work together with people, because there's so much that is needed in terms of infrastructural knowledge, the linguistic knowledge, the programming skills, and doing this all by yourself doesn't give you the scale and the speed that is needed to do things.
So I have a trick question for you next, and that's about conversational AI. So obviously, again, that's one of the most popular topics amongst people who listen to this podcast. So I get normally a lot of questions about it. So, but today I have an opportunity to ask a professional, an expert in language. So, what is your take on conversational AI? Because from my perspective, I don't know whether it's correct belief or opinion about it. A lot of things that we see in the media about conversational AI basically fake. So, I mean, there's just kind of demonstrators that are maybe trained on some very specific data, or there are claims that, I don't know, this particular conversational tool is better than human now. So what is your take on these tools? Do you trust them?
Yeah.
Do you have do you use Alexa or any of these things?
Well, that is, how long do you have? So it's quite, it's one of those things where it can be very good for certain things, and then for others it really isn't, and that has to do with the way it works. So I think some of these conversational AI resources that are out there are quite good when the task is very narrow and the field is very specific, so that the options that you can tackle are very clear, but then the broader it gets, so the more knowledge that you need and the more variety that is there, the trickier it gets. I mean, the typical example is last week I was trying to update my phone number for my credit card. And then this little screen when you do your online banking, and there pops up this little chatbot and asks you, so what do you want to do? Then you type something in, and then occasionally it works, but then you haven't typed exactly what their options in the keyword search are, and then suddenly the thing goes all wild, and there's, oh, you want to cancel your credit card, oh, you want to change banks, no, I don't, I just want to, but then it passes you on to the person behind, and then you have a proper chat and it all works out fine. But that is quite a good example of, if there are only certain options that people want to do when they go to a specific task, then conversational AI can be really very, very good. And also you can benefit, I think, I mean, my personal opinion, if you look at some things in customer service, or how you quickly do stuff that is just routine behavior, then you can get very quickly through stuff, and then you can save the time that you need to do something detailed, specific, in a specific way, with the human agents that you need to do this. But I wouldn't say, sometimes I talk to people in that space, and then they always say to me, oh, this problem is solved and it's that easy and you can do all these things. But ultimately, any conversational AI tool, needs to learn. So needs to learn from the data, needs to understand the habits, see the repetition. And obviously, a lot of language is phraseological. There's a lot of formulaic behavior, and you can pick that up and you can cover quite a lot with this. But then there's also, especially in the area of interpersonal behavior, there's a lot of vagueness and contextual factors and individual preferences, and that you can't easily capture. Mm-hmm. Maybe one other point about this, I think some of the things that we know from conversational AI, they can also, go the other way and help human beings when they communicate. So for instance, if people have very standard tasks, and we recently have done a study on how people respond via Twitter to customer feedback when customers complain about something. And then we analyzed lots of tweets to look at what people do. And in tweets like this, where you have very little time, very little space to deal with stuff, you can't work out every time how you open the tweet, how you close the tweet. You then become very formulaic. And there, if you use some of that conversational AI learning to see the patterns, that can then give people phrases and tools to do stuff quickly. But if you don't make it entirely automatized, but still keep the human being in there, I like this idea of the combination of both, trying to use the best of both worlds. That is where I'm most comfortable with, because the other thing I have about conversational AI is, obviously, if you look at the data that is used for learning purposes and how that data is gathered, and if you look at in commercial contexts, very often you tick a box and say you agree, because otherwise you can't use the device. But then most people don't really realize what happens to their data how it's used and how people have to listen in to, these things when you talk to a little box on your cupboard and say, can you switch on the lights? And then lots of data is collected, and this needs to be analyzed. And if we do something like this in our research, where we collect data that is evidence of human behavior, then we have to make people fill in consent forms. This has to go through an ethics process. And, how does this relate to privacy and security and all the rest of it? Because if you had no constraints, you could train your algorithms to learn much better, but you do have constraints, and some of them really for good reasons. So, that's another point that I tend to think about quite a bit.
So there are now some demonstrators. I don't know how good they really are. I mean, that's a question. But there are some demonstrators that we saw from, I think, Google, maybe DeepMind have done a few, where basically a machine could fool a human in a sense. I don't know whether you heard this example when a human being calls. I think it's a hairdresser, and there is basically conversational AI responding to these calls and making appointments, and people cannot understand that that's a machine, so they think it's a human being. So I personally think that that's just a lack of training that we have in talking to machines. We don't talk to machines very often, and at some point we will start distinguishing that this is a machine and this is a human being. We just don't have enough training. But in general, from linguistics point of view, what would, I know that that's a huge question, but maybe you just can pick like one thing. What is the main difference between human language and machine language?
So maybe stick with your hairdresser example. You can see why, if you just phone and say, oh, do you have an appointment on Saturday? And then the thing checks and says, we don't have anything on Saturday. Do you want to come Monday at 5? And then you just say, oh yeah, Monday at 5 is fine for me. Then that's kind of okay. But if you know your hairdresser and you say, look, I'd really like to have Julie do my hair, because last time this was absolutely wonderful. And do you remember what you did when you did this special hairdo for me when I went for the wedding? And then your conversational AI thing is completely out, because, there's nothing left to say that could happen there. And that is because the difference there is this interpersonal relationship. You know things about other people. You have got shared experience, and if you just have this, is there a slot on Monday, yes or no, then obviously you can't necessarily tell who's at the other end. But if you want to know, will the people be there? Do you still do the same coffee that you had last week? While I'm there, shall I pick up a couple of magazines or some? That has to do with shared background knowledge, individual parameters, and then also vagueness again comes in, because sometimes the hairdresser asks you, so what are we doing on Monday then? And our hairdresser's not open on Monday. Oh dear. Anyway, what are we doing then? And then you say, it's just the usual stuff. Okay. And how does the thing know the usual stuff unless you've already given all your contact details and have gone all the way through? And there's this vagueness, there's certain expressions and stuff like this and all these things. And,
so there are basically the training sets that are a problem, right? So that's just the machines are trained on data, and people can make these associative conclusions, I guess. And is that right?
Yeah, it's part of this, but it's also how the relationship between detail and generalizability. Because if you had a machine that you would just train on me and my particular hairdresser, you could probably make the result quite good, if that machine would listen in on all the conversations, and you would get better results. But that isn't scalable and isn't cost efficient, and no one is interested in having a conversational AI device that knows exactly what I do at the hairdresser. But you want something that a lot of people can use so that it's commercially viable and scalable. So
Mm-hmm. So Michaela, if someone wants to start in corpus linguistics, what should they do? Should they get into a course somewhere? Should they perhaps start a project? Where would you advise them to start the journey?
Yeah, there are different things. It depends on what kind of person you are, what you like doing. So something that was quite important to me after I had my initial module at university is that I did a summer school, and where you can just go and spend a week and learn all sorts of things, and especially do a lot of hands-on stuff so that you can see whether you like doing this, because you can obviously read about corpus linguistics and find it really interesting. But when it then comes down to looking at data, analyzing data, working with software programs, do you still like this as much as reading about trends and behaviors and things like this? So summer schools are obviously a good thing. It is, a book I'm still recommending, even though this is now 30 years old, but it's John Sinclair's Corpus Concordance Collocation. That is one of the really early textbooky style books, but it's so fundamental in terms of the linguistic insights that are central. So I would recommend to just have a look at this. Another thing is obviously looking at the International Journal of Corpus Linguistics, seeing what people do, what they do with corpus linguistics, what do they apply it to, what can you achieve. So, and there's now, because of the pandemic, but also already before that, there are now lots of videos available where corpus linguists talk about what they're researching, or conference presentations have been captured, or we have our Sinclair lecture series that you can get all as videos. So there's a lot where you can just dip your toe in without having to already commit, because I think it's good to, try it out, see what you can do with it and whether you'd like it.
Mm-hmm.
I think you would like it once you start looking, but yeah, I'm subjective, biased.
I'm sure, especially considering how much language, how important language is in every aspects of our lives. So we talked a lot about what corpus linguistics does, and so the next thing I want to ask you is about the future of corpus linguistics. So how do you think corpus linguistics is going to develop in the next 5 years? What would be the hot topics?
Well, that's a question. I think
perhaps something you are particularly excited. Sorry, perhaps something you are particularly excited about. Yeah.
Yeah, it's quite an exciting time for corpus linguistics right now, especially because so much is happening in data science and in other areas that are related, and so many different data sets are becoming available, and so many people are now interested in all sorts of analytics, dashboards, and I think what corpus linguistics, I don't know whether it will manage, but what it should is, it needs to become a lot more outward looking. So it's usually done by linguists with linguistics problems in mind, which is absolutely good and well, but you also need to see how the world in which you do linguistics has changed. So, in the 80s, people deliberately collected corpora, and that was a massive job to get 1 million words. Today, 1 million words is almost nothing, and your undergraduate students can collect bigger corpora in much faster ways. And I think what we need is understanding how we can use technology differently now, from where corpus linguistics started, but still keeping the linguistics in it. So if we now go completely, language is like any other data, and we're just only data scientists, then the linguistic insight won't be sufficient to actually be insightful from a linguistic point of view. But making this development reality is going to be quite challenging for corpus linguistics, and I hope that a lot will happen there. And in that regard, it's also important to look at relationships between data sets. So something like Google Trends, for instance. If you look at Google Trends, where people can check what has been searched for on Google. And then the Google News Lab does really interesting stuff where they relate trends to other data sets to then see how, something, again, they looked at presidential inaugural speeches, by a lot of American presidents. And then they looked at how topics that you find in these speeches resonate with people. So, when they talk about human rights or so, is this still something that people on Google Trends actually look for? Is that something that is still important to society today because people search this? And I think that's a good example to see how different data sets actually relate. So you don't just statically describe one data set, but you look at it as a relational problem. How does one influence the other, and how can you get complementary data? So by doing other experiments, or asking people, getting judgments on things, and that is where I hope that corpus linguistics will go.
Yeah, on this podcast, I had several guests who were talking precisely about this. That data science is a kind of as a service tool, right? And we always need the domain expertise to understand what is going on. So data science can only help; it cannot be kind of a thing in itself. It always requires some, theoretical ground. So that's. It's great to see that there is also this parallel in corpus linguistics as well, where probably more theory is needed, more of kind of this theoretical understanding, methodological understanding before we go into empirical stuff. How about your own work? What are you working on at the moment? What keeps you awake at night? What makes you excited?
Yeah, I mean, I'm working partly on some of these things we just discussed, as where could corpus linguistics go. So trying to conceptualize some of this, so mapping this out, trying to think about what would you need in an ideal world, how would people come together, what are the problems we could jointly solve, and then at the same time I'm also trying to do this so I'm currently also writing a textbook, so so I'm trying to look at these big problems of the discipline, but also thinking about, so how would you teach this now? So because you can easily then overwhelm beginners if it's always the big problems and everything is related to everything. How are you actually break this down into, as we talked about at the beginning, what are the key skills, what is the fundamental knowledge, and how do you extend the fundamental knowledge into specific areas of application? So that is what I'm currently looking at as a problem I'd really like to tackle, and then using various examples to play this through. So something I got increasingly interested in at this point in time is, so we talked about this relationship between fiction and reality already a bit, but also the power that is associated with this, and especially questions around equality and leadership, and how that actually manifests in language, and what you can do in this regard. And then taking some of these as case studies to look at the bigger problems and where corpus linguistics could go with the various data sets. So
sounds exciting. I mean, we now arrived at basically a couple of last questions that I wanted to ask you, and I have to say everyone complains about this next question, and the question is, if I ask you to recommend one book and one film, what would your recommendations be?
I think the film is probably predictable, but Skyfall, something I would absolutely recommend for various reasons. The book I'd recommend is Bleak House, Charles Dickens.
Okay, can you just tell us a little bit why this this film and why this book?
Yes, I mean, Skyfall is obviously a bit of escapism. It's always quite nice, but it's also really interesting in terms of learning about society and to what extent any of this is real, not real, or plays to people's attitudes about themselves and their desires to see the world in a certain way, and how they like their hero, and anyway.
I also know
Yeah.
that I watched actually the kind of the I think the documentary where they asked a lot of researchers, who work for law enforcement, about Skyfall, and a lot of them said that this was their favorite film because MI5 gets destroyed in this film. There is an explosion, and they apparently all these people believe that this is a really ugly building. So, anyways, how about why? Tell me about the book and why this book.
Just simply because when you read Dickens is just fabulous, the way he writes and the way he actually captures the essence of human beings in a way, again, that is fictional, but there's so much real stuff in it. And Bleak House specifically, because of the tangled way of the story and the connections and the world that is depicted there as a very complex place, and how people find their way through it. So it's it's a bit like a detective story, but but 19th century and really interesting and exciting.
And one more question that I have. So this year, I mean, last year I only was asking people about books and films, but this year I also decided that I will ask everyone about their favorite fictional character. And I know you must have a lot of them because you read a lot. But maybe a character will come to mind.
Yes, I can give you a temporary one because my favorites change quite a lot. But I think at the moment it's Miss Gwilt from Armadale, because she's quite an interesting woman, again in the 19th century, and the way she behaves and the way she outsmarts men, and the way she is morally challenging and therefore interesting is something I find quite fascinating.
Yes, great choice. Well, thank you so much, Michaela, for finding the time today to talk to me. It was great to have you with us. And I'm definitely looking forward to the handbook. And I hope
yes, I'm looking forward to your chapter.
And also the textbook that you mentioned. So good luck with that, and thanks a lot again for talking.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed this today. Thank you.